let's do some electric guitar repairs and pacify those who can't stand the acoustic building process to which I've been subjecting them for the last few weeks. We're going to start with a very rare condition. The patient, as you see, is a Jazzmaster, or a user-modified version of one. The Jazzmaster design came about in the late 1950s. It's a Leo Fender guitar, and it was courting, like the name suggests, the jazz-playing crowd of that time. So it was intended for people using fairly heavy flat-wound strings. Those are what, make this style of bridge function and give it a characteristic tone. We've got a situation here where this guitar is teetering on the precipice of effectiveness because the neck wants to backbow at normal string tension. You rarely see that in a Fender product, especially one with a vintage style truss rod. Sometimes they'll twist, but outright backbow, it's not very often. And of course, what's even stranger is that at this point, it's reached a bit of equilibrium right now, at the coldest, driest point in the year, and it's come back to just playable. The neck is very straight, and with an action of 4/64ths, which is 60 thousandths, which is 1.5 millimeters, it's just functional. However, a couple weeks ago it wasn't, and come spring it probably won't be again. The thing is, the truss rod nut is basically loose. It's not doing anything. Ordinarily, when the frets on a guitar like this are dressed, it's with a little bit of tension on the rod. You've heard me talk about this. It preloads the neck, and in the rare event that backbow is going to happen, you'll have some distance to travel when you loosen the rod, and the neck can then bow up to the necessary amount. If there's no tension at all, and you're relying on the neck to be straight when it's at rest, you end up with the backbow. There are ways to deal with this. We could dress the tops of the frets level, or even dress relief into the neck. In extreme cases, we could pull the frets all out and then dress the surface of the board itself, which is not always possible if it's a rosewood board with a veneered surface. In this case, this is a slab board. We could probably get away with it. But what I'm going to try and do is a reverse heat press. I'm going to warm the neck up and clamp it into an exaggerated forward bow, hoping it will hold on to some of that when the string tension gets reapplied. That would certainly be the most economical fix, if we can make it work. Sometimes it doesn't work. We'll see. Okay, I'm just going to check the action to start off with. I'm told it's 4/64ths, and I'd say it's more like 3.5. 3.5, and I'm going to say 3 on the treble side. Feels good. Neck relief is 3/1000ths of an inch, and less on the treble. Oh no, it's about 3 on both sides. 3/1000ths. You can get away with 3/1000ths. However, in this situation where there's no tension on the rod and it's apt to move going forward and backward, 3 is cutting it a bit close. Ordinarily, I'd like to see about 7 on a Strat or a Jazzmaster. And these are substantial strings. I think it's actually like a light top, heavy bottom, maybe. Yeah, 10 to 52, probably. These frets seem pretty tall, around 48, 50 thousandths. So if we have to dress some relief into neck that way, that's okay. We'd probably get away with it. This is kind of neat. The owner, who happens to be a guitar tech himself, has managed to fit a Seymour Duncan Super Distortion pickup into the case for the Jazzmaster. I'm going to loosen the neck plate screws. Just want to confirm that there's not anything going on with the truss rod, and it is completely loose. Got the notch straight edge, and at rest there is a pretty big hump. centered around the 7th fret. It's kind of where we'd expect it to be. But yeah, we're talking the range of, if I sort of center it, maybe a millimeter on both sides. So we're going to want to press that back past flat and into an up bow. Okay, I've got my neck heater out. This is a thick-walled rectangle of aluminum. It's got a couple of thermal resistance heaters epoxied to the inside of it using a high temperature epoxy. And that is controlled using this DC power supply. It gets to about 170 degrees Fahrenheit, so warm but not super warm. It takes about 45 minutes usually to get a neck up to a temperature I feel is appropriate. I know when it happens, when I feel the back of it and it feels hot. So I haven't got this clamped firmly. It's just there sitting on the fretboard. When the time comes, I'll remove the entire unit and just put an F-clamp with a cork-lined block in the center here to create the bow that I want, and we'll leave it like that for about 24 hours. I've clamped it about as far back as it was previously bowed forward. The gap is about a millimeter, 40 thousandths. After a day in the clamp, I've removed it, and the neck is now perfectly straight with no string tension. Frustratingly, once it was strung up, over the course of a day, the neck bowed right back to where it was before. So I decided to put a little bit of tension on the truss rod and then use an understring leveling beam to grind in a little bit of relief. It ends up being about 4 thousandths of an inch, but there's tension on the rod now. Naturally, that means I have to recrown and polish those frets back up again. They lost about 5 thousandths of total height, but there's still plenty of meat on them. Okay, strung up. We might be a little ahead of where we started. I had to slightly raise the bridge to get us to an action of 4/64. There is a phenomenon I've noticed, and I can't really quantify it in a meaningful way, but experience bears it out. And that is a guitar neck that contains a truss rod which isn't engaged or has no tension on it is frequently more unstable and suffers more movement than a guitar with no rod at all. A certain amount of material has to come out to accommodate the rod, remember. That decreases the neck's stiffness. As far as I'm concerned, a truss rod with no tension is a real red flag. You got to be careful with those guitars. So this now has a teeny tiny bit of pressure on it. Hopefully that's enough to make the neck behave. The surface of the board still has a little bit of backbow, and the fret tops now have some relief. I don't consider that an optimal condition, but sometimes it works. This guitar is owned by, like I said, a fellow guitar tech, and he's capable of refretting it if he wants to go that route. But this is a case of, I have the neck heater, he doesn't, so let me give it a shot for him. If this was a non-luthier customer, I might suggest just buying a new neck, because it's very unusual for this to happen in a guitar strung with 10 to 52 strings. The maple obviously has some latent stresses in it that makes it want to bend. That happens. And, do you really want to go to extraordinary lengths to make it work when it's always going to be kind of suspect? I don't know. We'll see. It's playable now. Up next, we're going to do a little show and tell kind of thing on a Fender Telecaster. And we'll talk about the beginnings of relicing electric guitars as a phenomenon, because this is one of the very first factory-sanctioned relic jobs. This is a Fender custom shop Tele from 1997. The custom shop as we know it came about in the mid-80s. The CBS era of ownership came to an end in 1984. Most people saw that as a good thing. The company was bought up by an investors group that included several employees. Seems like a good idea. They went about trying to recapture a little bit of that pre-CBS allure that had been lost through 20 years of mega corporation oversight. And part of that was trying to appease professional players in their endorsement program, trying to tailor the instruments to their specific needs. And in 1987, they opened up the Fender Custom Shop. Now, what they were doing was not really for general release to the public at all. It was literally a couple of in-house builders, two guys, replicating things or modding existing models for famous players like Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and so forth. Some of these players would want, say, the lacquer taken off the neck and maybe the profiles on the edges softened so it felt more familiar. But this stuff was all done in extremely small numbers for individuals. It wasn't like the average player had any access to it. So it went along like that. In the early 90s, Don Was, who is a well-traveled bassist, producer, session guy, he was in Was Not Was, he asked one of the custom shop builders who he knew to really dirty up a bass he was taking on tour with Bonnie Raitt, because it looked too squeaky clean and new and that wasn't his style. It wasn't even a Fender. It was made by Roger Sadowski. But that got the wheels turning in the custom shop. There was actually a lot of resistance from the leadership at Fender because this was the era when vintage forgeries were really starting to take off and, the money was starting to flow. They did not want to be seen to legitimize any part of that. It took several years before they were convinced to release factory-made Relic'd instruments to the public. Enter a man called Vince Cunetto, who was known to the custom shop people, specifically one of their leaders, Jay Black. Cunetto had been buying and selling guitars since the early 80s, and he'd also been really getting into what they called antiquing the guitars he made at that point. He was very exacting. He was tracing out vintage parts and remaking them in his own shop. Cunetto had worked as an auto body guy in his youth, so he had lots of experience working with finishes. He'd also been working on finding ways to reproduce vintage headstock decals. And that was not looked upon favorably. Fender said, "You stop doing that immediately." Or rather, maybe continue doing it, but do it only for us. And that led to him showing some of his antique finish work to the custom shop guys. They were very enthused, and there was an incident. They had him doctor up a Nocaster and a Mary Kay Strat, which they brought to the 1995 NAMM show. That's the National Association of Music Merchants. It's a huge industry trade convention, happens once or twice a year. I've never been, but I've heard it's fun. They put them in the showcase in the back of the booth, and initially didn't tell anyone that they were copies. But when they did reveal it, surprise, surprise, there was a huge amount of interest. A lot of people, it seems, want to play a beat-up guitar. And that convinced the leadership at Fender to greenlight this as a factory-available treatment. They would send batches of guitars to Vince Cunetto, and he would do his thing. This continued from 1995 to late 98. By 99, Fender was geared up to do this stuff in-house for regular production guitars. They made a couple of different series, and the arrangement with Cunetto ended. I'd like to cite my sources. A lot of this information I got from a really good article on fuzzfaced.com, written by Antonio Calvosa. It's an excellent site, lots of great history and information for people who like trivia about guitars. How do we know that this is one of those guitars that was outsourced by Fender to Cunetto for relicing? Well, on the back of the headstock here, there is the Fender Custom Shop logo, but this has been embossed into the wood with a press. Whereas in this period, standard Fender Custom Shop stuff came out with a water slide decal, not embossed. So this is one of those few guitars made during that 3-year period. There are ways of telling that this is not an original Fender Nocaster. Nocaster refers to a brief period in late 1950 into 51 when Fender was forced to clip the name of the model off of their decals. This model was originally known as the Broadcaster, but the Gretsch company contended that they owned that trademark for a line of their drums, At Fender, they said, okay, we'll just clip it off and keep working. Fender, of course, has since reissued the Nocaster. The defining feature is really like the neck profile. It's pretty chunky and U-shaped. It's a substantial neck. You probably won't find a vintage example with this much flame in it. If you did find one, it would be an accident, for sure. It's not a feature that Fender placed a premium on. They probably tried to sort most of it out, and they certainly didn't go looking for it. Again, talking about maple with latent warping tendencies, heavily figured wood like this has the potential to be more unstable than straight grain. Not always, but, you know, the grain is reversing every half inch here, and it can do funny things sometimes. This spot in particular. But, you know, this one seems to behave just fine. You can see some simulated wear on the neck, the little scallops in between the strings. This player ostensibly only played in the first position, really. Dan Erlewine, friend of the channel, started doing some of this, again, around the same period. He would take templates of Mylar from guitars that he liked, and he would reproduce this kind of wear, and wrote an article about that for the Guild of American Luthiers journal sometime around the early 90s. Yeah, but this looks pretty good. And the wear on the edges of the body also looks really clean and tasteful. Of course, after 30 years, who's to say if this is, you know, the way it looked like in 1997 or not? Maybe this is honest wear. How would you know? There is one area, though, that kind of made me recoil in horror when I saw it, and I don't quite understand how they allowed this to be. That is the wear on this pickguard. It is quite noticeably done with a stencil. And, I mean, original guards were made from Bakelite, and they do divot and dull down from pickwear, but this looks like a taco with a bite taken out of it. I don't get it. I mean, I could make this look more natural, but we're into the strange world of rare, high-value reproductions. So fixing this to look more correct would be incorrect, and I'd probably be devaluing the guitar somehow. I'm not going to lie. It's going to bug me. It was early days. I mean, this was the time when vintage nerd geekery was really beginning to get underway, and quite a lot of reissues were really in name only. Like, the color was right. What more do you want? 1997 is also the very beginnings of the internet culture of sharing this kind of information. Like, unless you were George Gruen or Norm from Norm's Rare Guitars, you probably didn't have a lot of these things on hand to compare one by one. But, you know, it is what it is. This guitar is also outfitted with compensated brass saddles. Now, the brass is correct. The compensation, of course, was not something they were doing in 1950, but I have no problem with that. What is an issue for this player is these outside screws beside the E-strings. They are quite tall and very sharp, which is frequently the case because you have this threaded surface right next to a slot-type surface. And he's wondering whether we can reduce those in height so that he's less likely to impale his hand on them, which is a common thing, and we can do that, no problem.
I'll take a quick measurement to see how much I can remove. I'll use this ridiculous mini belt sander to get off most of the excess. I'll soften the sharp corner with a file. Do a little work on the frets and take care of some divots from the strings and wear marks in the lower positions. And I'm using tape like I usually do. If this was a guitar from 1950, I probably wouldn't, but the lacquer in this case is a different formula. It's pretty robust and can stand the tape without flaking right off. But just going to do a little bit of recrowning, dressing, and polishing, obviously. Here I'm just rounding things over, then I'll make them gleam.
Just for giggles, let's have a look inside here. Let's see what the electronics are like. Okay, I don't believe this is factory wiring. That pot's had some adventures. Interesting. And there's a spongy shop towel down here. I guess they were trying to prevent a rattle or something. Or maybe this has a shielding paint in the cavity. Maybe stuff was grounding out on that, so they put a barrier.
Someone put the solder blob right over the date.
The other thing the owner wants me to do is have a look inside the neck pocket to see what's in there. Looking inside the neck pocket, there is a very thin factory shim and a date stamp of January 16th, 1997. It is January 16th today, so this is 29 years ago, to the date. The neck stamps, John Cruz and O. Polares. And the word Relic is stamped into the body wood under the neck plate, which I believe was a measure to prevent these things from being mistaken for actual 1950 Telecaster no-caster bodies. The action's a bit high and there is way too much relief in this neck. Looking at about 20 thousandths. String tension off. I'm going to remove the forward screws. Don't be one of those people who puts a big divot right in the center of the metal cover of the neck pickup. Make sure there's enough clearance. You're not going to mar things. And of course we've got another truss rod which is absolutely loose. No tension at all. This is the vintage style truss rod boogie. Put it all back together, see if that did it. If not, then we take it all back apart again. Okay, now we are at about 12 thousandths, maybe 11. I think I want one more tiny little turn. You can see that the neck was made slightly later, the end of January. You can also see that this neck is perfectly flat sawn, as opposed to quarter sawn. The grain runs right through from side to side, rather than up and down. 7 thousandths. I can live with that. Action is a hair low, 3/64ths. There we go, ready for another 30 years. Ah, so smooth and silky to the touch.